The sun was setting over downtown Atlanta, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and purple. Officer James Mitchell let out a tired sigh as he cruised down Henderson Avenue in his patrol car. It had been a long day, filled with the usual mix of traffic violations and minor incidents. His shift was almost over, and he was already thinking about the leftover lasagna waiting for him at home. As he approached the intersection near Pine Street, something caught his attention. A sleek, black Range Rover with slightly tinted windows rolled through a stop sign without coming to a complete halt. Officer Mitchell straightened up in his seat, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He'd seen this kind of behavior countless times before, usually just someone in a hurry to get home, but rules were rules. He flipped on his patrol car's lights, watching as the luxury SUV smoothly pulled over to the curb. The vehicle's brake lights glowed red against the darkening sky, and Mitchell noticed how the car's pristine finish reflected the flashing blue and red lights of his patrol car. "Dispatch, I'm initiating a traffic stop on a black Range Rover," he spoke into his radio, reciting the license plate number with practiced ease. As he stepped out of his patrol car, Mitchell adjusted his body camera and straightened his uniform, habits ingrained from years on the force. The evening air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming jasmine from nearby gardens. Mitchell's boots crunched softly on the asphalt as he approached the vehicle, his right hand resting casually near his utility belt, another habit from years of training. From his position, he could see the driver's silhouette through the tinted rear window, seemingly calm and still. Something about this stop felt different, though Mitchell couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe it was the way the driver had pulled over so smoothly, or how the vehicle sat perfectly parallel to the curb, not the usual hasty, angular parking job he typically encountered. As he drew closer to the driver's side window, Mitchell noticed it was already rolling down. This, too, was unusual. Most people waited for his tap on the glass. The interior light illuminated the cabin, revealing a well-dressed man in his 50s, hands placed purposefully at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. His suit looked expensive, the kind you'd see in those high-end downtown offices, and a subtle cologne scent wafted through the open window. What struck Officer Mitchell most wasn't the man's obvious prosperity or his calm demeanor, it was the resigned look in his eyes, as if he'd been through this routine many times before. Before Mitchell could even ask for license and registration, the driver already had them ready in his hand, held out with a steady grip. The whole scene felt like a carefully rehearsed play, one where both actors knew their parts all too well. Mitchell found himself pausing, his usual script momentarily forgotten. In all his years of traffic stops, something about this one made him question his automatic responses and assumptions. The streetlights had fully come on now, casting long shadows across the scene. In the distance, a church bell chimed 7 times, its sound carrying clearly through the quiet neighborhood. Officer Mitchell cleared his throat, preparing to speak, unaware that this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. Little did he know, the next few minutes would challenge everything he thought he knew about his job, his city, and himself. The man behind the wheel wasn't just another traffic violation, he was about to become the catalyst for a profound change in Officer Mitchell's life. As Mitchell accepted the offered documents, he couldn't shake the feeling that this evening was about to take an unexpected turn. The cool Atlanta breeze rustled through nearby trees, setting the stage for what would become one of the most memorable encounters of his career. Officer Mitchell studied the license and registration under the glow of his flashlight. The documents were pristine, kept in a leather wallet that probably cost more than his weekly paycheck. Everything was perfectly organized, almost as if the driver had been expecting to be pulled over at some point during his evening drive. The driver sat patiently, his hands still resting visibly on the steering wheel. His gold wedding ring caught the flashlight's beam, and Mitchell noticed a hospital parking pass hanging from the rearview mirror. The man's calm demeanor was almost unsettling. There was no nervous fidgeting, no anxious glances in the mirrors, just a quiet dignity that seemed to fill the entire vehicle. "Good evening, sir," Mitchell finally said, his voice carrying through the quiet street. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" The driver's response was measured, his voice deep and assured. "Yes, officer. I believe I didn't come to a complete stop at the sign back there." There was something in his tone, not defiance, not submission, but a kind of weary knowledge that spoke of similar encounters over many years. Mitchell nodded, surprised by the honest admission. Most people try to make excuses or deny their infractions entirely. He shined his light briefly around the vehicle's interior, noting the spotless leather seats and a briefcase in the passenger seat with what looked like medical files peeking out. "Where are you heading this evening?" Mitchell asked, following his usual protocol while trying to ignore the growing feeling that this stop was different from his usual encounters. "I'm heading home from the hospital," the driver replied. "I had a lengthy surgery today." He paused for a moment, then added, "I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon at Atlanta Medical Center." Something clicked in Mitchell's mind. He looked more closely at the license in his hand, reading the name again. The knot in his stomach tightened as recognition dawned on him. The perfectly maintained car, the hospital parking pass, the medical files, it all suddenly made sense. The street remained quiet except for the occasional passing car and the distant sound of a dog barking. The patrol car's lights continued their rhythmic flashing, painting the scene in alternating blue and red. A couple walking their dog on the opposite sidewalk slowed down to watch the scene, their curiosity barely concealed. Mitchell's thoughts raced back to 3 months ago, to the hospital waiting room where he'd sat with his mother, both of them terrified as his father underwent emergency heart surgery. He remembered the surgeon who had walked out to speak with them, confident, compassionate, professional. The same man who now sat in this Range Rover, waiting patiently for a traffic ticket. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Mitchell. Yet he was about to write a ticket to the man who had saved his father's life. But more than that, he was faced with the uncomfortable reality of his own assumptions when he'd first initiated the stop. He'd seen an expensive car with tinted windows and had made split-second judgments without even realizing it. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees lining the street, carrying with it the sweet scent of someone's evening barbecue. The moment stretched out, heavy with unspoken understanding between the two men. The driver's eyes met Mitchell's in the rearview mirror, and there was no accusation there, just a patient acceptance that made Mitchell's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. The whole scene felt surreal, like one of those moments that change the course of your life without any warning. Here was a highly respected surgeon, someone who literally held people's lives in his hands every day, sitting through a routine traffic stop with the kind of patience that could only come from having experienced this many times before. Mitchell cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how dry his mouth had become. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own biases and assumptions. The driver's calm exterior seemed to hide years of similar experiences, each one leaving its mark, but never breaking his professional demeanor. As the night settled fully around them, Mitchell realized this traffic stop was about to become much more than just another entry in his daily log. It was about to become a turning point, not just in his career, but in his understanding of the world and his role in it. Officer Mitchell's hands trembled slightly as he looked down at the driver's license again. Dr. William Carter, the name hit him like a wave of memories. The same doctor who had spent 6 hours in surgery saving his father's life just 3 months ago. The same man who had walked out to the waiting room, still in his scrubs, to tell Mitchell and his mother that the operation had been successful. He remembered that day so clearly. His father had collapsed during Sunday dinner, and within hours they were rushing to the hospital. The doctors had discovered a severe blockage that required immediate surgery. Mitchell had been terrified, sitting in that waiting room, his police uniform wrinkled from the long hours, holding his mother's hand as they waited for news. When Dr. Carter had approached them that evening, his face showed the exhaustion of a lengthy surgery, but his eyes were kind and confident. He had explained everything in simple terms, making sure they understood exactly what he had done to save Mitchell's father's life. Now, standing here on this quiet street, Mitchell felt a strange mix of emotions washing over him. The luxury SUV's engine hummed softly in the background, and somewhere nearby, crickets had started their evening chorus. A warm breeze carried the scent of blooming gardenias from a nearby yard, creating an oddly peaceful atmosphere despite the tension of the moment. "Dr. Carter," Mitchell finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't recognize you at first." The doctor's expression changed slightly. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, but his hands remained steady on the steering wheel. "Officer Mitchell," he replied, his voice carrying the same warmth it had in the hospital. "How is your father doing?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. He was a man who had every right to be angry or resentful about being pulled over, yet his first thought was to ask about his patient's well-being. Mitchell swallowed hard. "He's doing great, thanks to you. He's back to working in his garden and walking the dog every morning. Mom says we can barely get him to sit still anymore." A genuine smile spread across Dr. Carter's face, the kind that reached his eyes and softened his whole expression. "That's wonderful to hear. Gardening is excellent exercise for cardiac recovery. Just remember to tell him not to overdo it in this heat." The absurdity of the situation suddenly struck Mitchell full force. Here he was, having a conversation about his father's recovery with one of the city's most respected heart surgeons, all because of a rolling stop at a quiet intersection. The red and blue lights from his patrol car continued their rhythmic dance across the scene, a stark reminder of how this interaction had begun. A car passed by slowly, its occupants curiously watching the scene. A common occurrence during traffic stops, but this was far from a common traffic stop. Mitchell thought about all the assumptions he'd made when he first spotted the Range Rover. He thought about how quickly he'd categorized the driver before even seeing his face. The weight of his badge felt heavier than usual on his chest. In the police academy, they talked about bias and profiling, but it was always in abstract terms. Standing here now, facing a man who had literally held his father's heart in his hands, the reality of those lessons hit home in a way no classroom discussion ever could. Dr. Carter maintained his professional composure, but there was something in his eyes. A depth of understanding that spoke of countless similar situations throughout his career. How many times had he been pulled over? How many times had he had to maintain this same calm demeanor while being questioned? The thought made Mitchell's stomach twist. The night had grown darker around them, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. A few fireflies had begun their evening dance in a nearby garden, their gentle lights a sharp contrast to the harsh flashing of the patrol car's lights. The moment felt frozen in time, like a photograph capturing a pivotal moment in both their lives. Mitchell looked down at the license and registration in his hands again, then back at Dr. Carter. The urge to apologize was overwhelming, but somehow, a simple "I'm sorry" seemed inadequate for the complexity of the situation. He needed to do more than apologize. He needed to understand, to learn, to change. The realization of his own unconscious bias hit Officer Mitchell like a physical blow. Standing there in the gentle evening breeze, he found himself remembering all the times he defended himself against accusations of profiling. "I treat everyone the same," he'd always said. But did he really? Would he have made the same split-second decision to pull over this Range Rover if he'd somehow known who was behind the wheel? Mitchell shifted his weight from one foot to the other, aware of how his utility belt creaked with the movement. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet evening air. He glanced back at his patrol car, its lights still painting the street in alternating colors, creating an almost theatrical backdrop for this moment of truth. "Dr. Carter," he began, then paused, searching for the right words. "I've been thinking about how this stop began, about the assumptions I made." The surgeon raised his hand slightly, a gentle gesture that somehow carried the same authority he must show in the operating room. "Officer Mitchell, I understand. You were doing your job. I did roll through that stop sign. I was thinking about my last patient of the day, wondering if I'd made the right call on his medication." The humility in Dr. Carter's response only made Mitchell feel worse. He was a man who held lives in his hands every day, who had to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death, and yet he was calmly accepting responsibility for a minor traffic violation. A group of teenagers walked past on the sidewalk, their laughter and chatter momentarily breaking the intensity of the moment. Their phones came out to record the scene, another traffic stop, another video. But they couldn't know what was really happening here, couldn't understand the profound shift taking place in Officer Mitchell's worldview. "You know," Dr. Carter continued, his voice taking on a thoughtful tone, "I've been pulled over 17 times in the past 5 years. Each time, I keep my insurance card and registration in easy reach. I keep my hands visible. I stay calm. I've learned these things are necessary, even after 30 years as a surgeon, even with all the lives I've saved." Mitchell felt his chest tighten. The number seemed impossibly high, yet he knew it was probably true. He thought about his own father, how this man had saved his life, and how many other lives he must have saved over his career. Yet here he was, having to maintain a careful routine during traffic stops, having to prove himself over and over again. The crickets had grown louder now, their chorus a constant backdrop to this unexpected moment of truth. A car alarm went off in the distance, its harsh sound a jarring intrusion into the quiet evening. Mitchell noticed Dr. Carter didn't flinch at the sudden noise, perhaps too used to the high-pressure environment of the operating room to be startled by such things. "My son just got his license," Dr. Carter said softly, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. "The night he passed his test, instead of just celebrating, I had to sit him down and explain how to handle himself during traffic stops. How to move slowly, speak calmly, keep his hands where they can be seen. No parent should have to have that conversation, but here we are." The words hung heavy in the air between them. Mitchell thought about his own son, just 7 years old, playing with his toy police car at home. Would he ever have to have similar conversations with him? The thought made him deeply uncomfortable, forcing him to confront realities he'd previously chosen to ignore. The evening had grown cooler, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded, a lonely, haunting noise that seemed to underscore the importance of this moment. Mitchell looked down at the citation book in his hand, still unused, then back at Dr. Carter. The surgeon's face remained calm, patient, showing no sign of the frustration he must surely feel. This wasn't just about a rolling stop anymore. It wasn't even about this one traffic stop. This was about patterns, about systemic issues that Mitchell had been part of without fully acknowledging it. The weight of this understanding pressed down on him, demanding action, demanding change. A police radio crackled to life in the background, another officer calling in a traffic stop across town. The familiar sound reminded Mitchell of his duty, but somehow the meaning of that duty had shifted in the past few minutes. What did it really mean to protect and serve? Who was he really protecting, and who was he serving? Officer Mitchell tucked his citation book back into his pocket, a decision made more with his heart than his training. "Would you mind if we talked for a few minutes, Dr. Carter?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than authority. The surgeon nodded, and Mitchell noticed his shoulders relax slightly, though his hands remained visible on the steering wheel. "Of course, Officer Mitchell. Though I have to admit, this is a first. Usually, these stops end differently." Mitchell glanced around, then gestured to a nearby bench under a streetlight. "Would you be comfortable stepping out of your vehicle? Maybe we could sit down there." He quickly added, "Just to talk. Nothing official." Dr. Carter considered the request for a moment, then nodded. As he stepped out of his Range Rover, Mitchell noticed how his movements were deliberate and measured. Another learned behavior from years of similar situations. The surgeon's white coat was still crisp despite the long day of surgeries, and his hospital ID badge caught the streetlight's glow. They settled onto the bench, two men from different worlds finding common ground on a warm evening in Atlanta. The patrol car's flashing lights continued their dance in the background, but somehow they seemed less important now. "You mentioned 17 traffic stops," Mitchell began, his voice quiet but clear. "Would you tell me more about that? I mean, if you're willing to share." Dr. Carter looked up at the night sky, where a few stars were beginning to peek through the city's light pollution. "The first few made me angry," he admitted. "I was younger then, fresh out of medical school, already dealing with people questioning my abilities because of my skin color. The stops felt like one more burden to bear." A couple walked past with their dog, the pet pulling at its leash to sniff in their direction. Both men paused their conversation, aware of the curious glances thrown their way, an unusual sight, a police officer and a black man in a white coat, sitting on a bench in casual conversation. "Over time," Dr. Carter continued, "I learned to handle it differently. I started focusing on what I could control, keep my car maintained, drive exactly the speed limit, always use turn signals. But even with all that, he spread his hands in a gesture that spoke volumes." Mitchell nodded, thinking about his own father again. "The day you operated on my dad," he said, "I never once questioned your abilities, never even thought about your race. I just saw the doctor who was going to save my father's life. But tonight, when I saw your car—" "You saw what you expected to see," Dr. Carter finished for him, his tone free of accusation. "It's a common story, Officer Mitchell. The question is, what do we do with these moments of recognition? A gentle breeze rustled through nearby trees, carrying the sweet scent of someone's flowering garden. In the distance, children's laughter echoed from a nearby playground, a reminder of the future they were really talking about. "You know," Dr. Carter said, adjusting his tie thoughtfully, "I performed 3 surgeries today. One was on a police officer's wife. Another was on a young teacher. The last was on a grandmother of 6. When they're on my operating table, I don't see their race, their profession, their social status. I just see people who need my help." Mitchell felt the weight of those words. He thought about his own work, about the split-second decisions he made every day. How many of those decisions had been influenced by unconscious biases he hadn't even recognized? "The hardest part," Dr. Carter continued, his voice taking on a teacher's patience, "isn't the stops themselves anymore. It's explaining to my children why they happen. My daughter's starting medical school next year. She wants to be a surgeon like me, but she also sees how I'm treated sometimes, despite all my achievements." A police radio crackled again from Mitchell's patrol car, but neither man paid it much attention. This conversation felt more important than any call could be right now. The evening had grown cooler, but neither seemed to notice, too engaged in this unexpected moment of honest dialogue. "I've never told anyone this," Dr. Carter said, leaning forward slightly, "but sometimes I wonder how many lives might have been saved if talented young people hadn't been discouraged from pursuing medicine because of experiences like these. How many potential surgeons, researchers, or doctors have we lost because they couldn't bear the weight of constant suspicion?" The conversation had opened something in Officer Mitchell's mind that couldn't be closed again. He sat there on the bench, his badge catching the streetlight's glow, thinking about his police academy days. They'd had training about bias, sure, PowerPoint presentations and role-playing exercises that seemed so simple in the controlled environment of a classroom. But none of that compared to this real-world moment. "You know what really opened my eyes at the hospital?" Mitchell said, breaking a moment of thoughtful silence. "It was watching you work with your team during my father's surgery. Through the observation window, I could see how everyone in that operating room looked to you for guidance. Nobody cared about anything except your skill and experience. Lives depended on it." Dr. Carter nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "The operating room is probably the most honest place I know. When someone's heart isn't beating, nothing matters except knowledge and skill. But step outside those hospital doors." He left the sentence unfinished, but its meaning hung heavy in the air. A police helicopter passed overhead, its searchlights sweeping across the neighborhood. Both men watched it pass, perhaps thinking about the different ways they each served their community. "During my father's recovery," Mitchell continued, his voice thoughtful, "I remember how the other doctors would consult with you, how the nurses respected your opinion. You weren't just any surgeon, you were the one they turned to for the tough cases. But tonight, when I saw your car, you saw what you were trained to see," Dr. Carter finished. "We all carry these preconceptions, Officer Mitchell. The question is whether we're willing to recognize them and learn from them." The night had grown quiet around them, save for the distant sound of traffic and the steady hum of crickets. Mitchell's patrol car lights still flashed rhythmically, creating moving shadows that danced across the sidewalk. "Something happened last week," Dr. Carter said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "I was leaving the hospital late, still in my scrubs. A woman saw me approaching in the parking garage and quickly walked the other way, clutching her purse. The irony? I had just spent 6 hours saving her husband's life in surgery. She didn't recognize me without my white coat." Mitchell felt his chest tighten at the story. He thought about similar situations he'd witnessed, or worse, situations where he'd been the one making assumptions. "The thing is," Dr. Carter continued, straightening his tie absently, "I've learned to use these moments as teaching opportunities. In that garage, I could have felt angry or hurt. Instead, I choose to hope that maybe next time, that woman will think twice before making assumptions. Just like I hope this conversation might change how you approach your next traffic stop." A group of young residents walked past, their hospital badges still visible on their scrubs. They nodded respectfully to Dr. Carter, then did a double take at seeing him sitting with a police officer. Mitchell noticed how their expressions shifted from concern to curiosity. "You know what the hardest part of my job is?" Dr. Carter asked, watching the young doctors disappear around the corner. It's not the complex surgeries or the long hours. It's knowing that no matter how many lives I save, no matter how many medical breakthroughs I achieve, to some people I'll always be seen as a threat first and a doctor second. Mitchell thought about his own son again, about the world he was growing up in. He thought about Dr. Carter's children, about that difficult conversation about traffic stops that no parent should have to have. The training we get, Mitchell said slowly, it's supposed to help us identify threats and protect the community. But sometimes I wonder if we're creating the very problems we're trying to solve, when every unfamiliar situation is approached as a potential threat. Then everyone becomes a potential threat, Dr. Carter finished. And when you're constantly treated as a threat, it changes you. It makes you second-guess every move, every word, every action. That's the weight many of us carry every day. The moon had risen higher in the sky now, casting a gentle light that seemed to soften the harsh glare of the street lamps. In the distance, an ambulance siren wailed, a sound that carried different meanings for each of them, yet somehow connected their worlds. The evening had grown late, and Officer Mitchell knew he needed to wrap up this traffic stop that had become so much more. But somehow, simply writing a ticket or giving a warning didn't feel right anymore. This moment called for something different, something meaningful. Dr. Carter, Mitchell said, standing up from the bench, I want you to know that this conversation, it's going to stay with me. Not just tonight, but throughout my career. He gestured toward his patrol car, its lights still painting the street in blue and red. I'm going to turn those lights off now. They don't belong in this moment anymore. As Mitchell walked to his car and switched off the emergency lights, the street settled into a gentler darkness, lit only by street lamps and the moon above. When he returned, Dr. Carter had also stood up, his white coat almost glowing in the evening light. You know, Dr. Carter said, in surgery, we have something called teachable moments, times when an unexpected situation leads to important learning. Tonight wasn't just about a rolling stop at an intersection. It was about two people taking the time to see each other as human beings. Mitchell nodded, thinking about how he would approach his next traffic stop and the one after that. I've been thinking about what you said about your daughter starting medical school, he said. I want to be part of making sure she lives in a world where she's judged by her skills as a doctor, not by assumptions made at first glance. Dr. Carter smiled warmly. Change happens one conversation at a time, Officer Mitchell. One traffic stop, one hospital visit, one human interaction at a time. Just then, Mitchell's radio crackled to life. Another officer was requesting backup a few blocks away. Before Mitchell could respond, Dr. Carter spoke up. You should go. Someone might need your help. Mitchell hesitated, then pulled out his notepad, not to write a ticket, but to jot down his name and badge number. Dr. Carter, would you be willing to speak at our next department training session? Share your experiences, help other officers understand what we've talked about tonight. The surgeon accepted the paper, tucking it carefully into his coat pocket. I'd be honored, he replied. And Officer Mitchell, next time you see a Range Rover rolling through a stop sign, remember tonight. Remember that sometimes the biggest threats aren't the ones we're trained to look for. They're the assumptions we make without even realizing it. As they walked back to their vehicles, a young couple passed by, holding hands. They slowed down, probably curious about why a police officer and a doctor in a white coat were standing together on a quiet street corner. Mitchell realized that this too was part of the change, letting people see that these conversations could happen, that understanding was possible. Dr. Carter, Mitchell called out just as the surgeon reached his car door. Thank you, not just for saving my father's life, but for taking the time tonight to help me see things differently. And thank you, Officer Mitchell, Dr. Carter replied, for being willing to listen. That's where change begins. As Mitchell watched the Range Rover pull away smoothly into the night, he thought about all the reports he'd have to file, all the paperwork that came with any traffic stop. But how could he possibly document this? How could he capture in official police language the way this evening had shifted something fundamental in his understanding of his role as an officer? Back in his patrol car, Mitchell sat for a moment before responding to the backup call. He thought about the conversation he'd have with his fellow officers tomorrow, about the changes he wanted to help create in his department. He thought about Dr. Carter's daughter starting her journey to become a surgeon and hoped that by the time she finished her training, the world would be a little bit different. As he turned his car toward his next call, Mitchell realized that while his shift might be ending soon, something new was just beginning. The real work, the work of changing minds and hearts, including his own, was only just starting. The night air seemed fresher somehow as he drove through the city streets, past homes and businesses, past people going about their lives. Each person he saw was someone's father, mother, daughter, or son. Each one had their own story, their own struggles and triumphs. And his job, he now understood more clearly than ever, was to protect and serve all of them, without exception and without prejudice. The backup call turned out to be routine, but Mitchell handled it differently than he might have just a few hours ago. He found himself looking more carefully, listening more intently, and remembering Dr. Carter's words about how quick judgments can shape entire lives.